Hello, and welcome to another discussion of foods and drinks that you consume most likely. So today we're talking about sweet tea for Fission 101. And I love starting with the history. So discussing the history of sweet tea, there's a French botanist who introduced tea leaves to the United States in 1795. And this happened in Charleston, South Carolina. Well, South Carolina was the only state producing tea at the time, and so they were someone who's kind of known for it at that moment. In 1879, a version of sweet tea was produced by Marion Cabell Tyree. And although that version of sweet tea was actually with a green tea, it was the first actual recorded recipe of a tea with sugar. In 1928, sweet tea became the Southern staple that it is today, but it was usually reserved for the high class or the elite. But in 2003, Georgia introduced a bill because this had become a staple to not just the high class, but to everyone. And so they wanted everyone to have access in every restaurant they ever went to in Georgia. So there's actually a bill requiring restaurants in the state to serve sweet tea. No joke. And today the beverage is enjoyed by millions all over the United States. So what's the tea about sweet tea? Well, sweet tea is made using tea and a sweetener, but that sweetener can vary. We can have sweeteners like honey, or table sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, or even artificial sweeteners. If you go to a restaurant and they give you a traditional non-sweet tea in Illinois, you may look on the table and they may say, sweeten it yourself. And you may see something like Splenda, Equal, or Sweet and Low there on the table so that you can do so with an artificial sweetener. Artificial sweeteners are used instead of sugar, oftentimes to reduce sugar intake, and while maintaining that palatability or that sweetness, humans use the same taste receptors. However, we can perceive sweetness very differently, even though anatomically and physiologically we're supposed to be the same. So even if you're having one sweetener, you're like, that tastes a little bit bitter. Your friend next to you might be like, I don't taste that bitterness at all. I think it tastes fabulous. So keep in mind that genetic disparities are one of the reasons why in food science and human nutrition, specifically the food science sector, we have individuals who are actually hired to do taste testings. So we have whole panels, and if you're interested in getting involved in something like that, reach out and maybe we can connect you with someone. So when we're talking about tea, one of the most popular teas that has been made in the South is a sweet sun tea. And the most popular method of making the sweet sun tea uses a 1-gallon glass jar, 16 cups of filtered water, 16 regular tea bags, table sugar, and if you want, you can use some lemon wedges. You want to fill the glass jar with the filtered water and black tea bags, and then close the jar with the lid and leave it in the direct sunlight for 3 to 4 hours. Oftentimes people think the sun is magical and it makes this delicious tea. We'll talk more about that later. But what you're then going to do is remove the tea bags, pour the tea into a pot and bring it to a boil. That hot water is going to allow for more sugar to be dissolved into that tea itself. So add the sugar in, stir until it's dissolved, and then what you can do is pour it into a glass and add ice, or you can refrigerate it right away. You can garnish with lemon if it's preferred, and enjoy. A little tip and trick. The rule of thumb with making tea is you want to have 8 ounces or 1 cup of water for every 1 tea bag. Let's say you don't want to leave your tea in the sun and you're like, you know what, it's the wintertime, we're in the middle of central Illinois, but I want to make some tea. Similar to sun tea, what you can do is use a refrigeration method. So what you do is you add the water and tea bags into the glass jar just like you would with a traditional sun tea. But instead of leaving it in the sun, you leave the container in the refrigerator for 3 to 5 hours. Then what you can do is add sugar and lemon for garnish, and if preferred, you can add other things into that tea itself. Then what you want to do is refrigerate the tea when it's not consumed, just like you would that sun tea. So let's review the sun tea recipe. What is the science behind it? Well, first of all, why does the recipe use black tea? Well, leaving tea unrefrigerated could increase the chances of food safety issues because the temperature is suited for bacterial growth. So we're right between that 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Microorganisms love that. The black tea itself can actually decrease concerns a little because it has some antibacterial properties. So why does the tea left in direct sunlight, why is it that we need to boil that afterwards? Well, the reason that we want to boil it afterwards is because there's still bacteria in there. So we just left this tea in the 40 to 140 degree range in sunlight. So bacteria love to grow in that condition, even in tea. So we boil it to decrease the likelihood of getting something like a foodborne illness. So the tea that's refrigerated, we don't necessarily need to boil that because the low temperature in the refrigerator, that 40 degrees, decreases some bacterial overgrowth. Why is sugar added in after the tea is done steeping? Well, modest amounts of sugar in tea can increase the chances of bacterial growth, as many bacteria use sugar as food, and so adding it after the steeping actually helps keep it a little bit safer as well. Let's further discuss this. Myth versus fact. Let's look at the sun tea process. Traditional sun tea is made using the first method, which we discussed, leaving it in the sun for a few hours. Believe it or not, this method can be unsafe if the tea is not boiled after it was left in direct sunlight. So many believe that putting water in tea bags in direct sunlight heats the water, creating a delicious tea without the need to boil the water. Well, the fact is the sunlight does not affect the flavor or hasten the tea making process because the water does not get really hot enough. It's not going to get there. So 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what the tea temperature can get to if it's in direct sunlight in a hot day and something like in a place like Georgia, that's right there in that danger zone, which can allow bacteria to grow. So in method 1, the tea is boiled after it is left in the direct sunlight to help kill those bacteria. In method 2, the tea is not exposed to direct sunlight because the sunlight doesn't affect the tea making process, believe it or not. It's not going to change the flavor profile. So instead, it's brewed inside the refrigerator, which helps decrease that danger zone. When we look at the chemistry of sweet tea, it really is very simple. You have tea, or the tea bag, you have water, you have a sweetener, and sometimes you use lemon for flavoring or for garnish. In the tea itself, there are polyphenols. Polyphenols are going to be these beneficial non-nutrients in the tea itself. So these polyphenols are going to help with your health and well-being. In fact, research points to the fact that it can actually decrease the likelihood of blood clots, meaning that you're decreasing the likelihood of struggling with things like strokes, pulmonary embolisms, or even a heart attack. Having polyphenols in your diet can reduce blood sugar. Interesting. And having polyphenols that you consume actually lowers cardiovascular disease risk as well. Let's learn a little bit more about the chemistry of sweet tea. Additional sugars and artificial sweeteners don't alter tea chemistry. So even though you might be like, oh gosh, I don't want to add that sugar in because it's going to change how it's absorbed or what have you, the sugars are going to alter how the bacteria and other microorganisms are going to interact with it, but it really doesn't alter the tea chemistry. So with that in mind, those polyphenols are not going to be negatively impacted by adding sugars or artificial sweeteners before or after steeping. They will just impact, like I said, the microbiota. When we're wanting to have a really sweet tea, something that you can do is make what we call a simple syrup. A simple syrup is, very simply put, an extremely concentrated sugar water solution. You can dissolve sugar in the water, and so what you want to do is you heat up the water, you add in a lot of sugar, and you're going to take that sugar from its crystalline form, or again sugar crystals, and you're going to make it more as a liquid sugar. This is a physical change. It should not be a chemical change. So it's not like we're going to be making like a caramel or a caramel. We're actually just, again, making that simple syrup, and we're changing the crystals into kind of what we call like a liquefied sugar. Even though the additional sugars and artificial sweeteners won't alter the tea chemistry, I do want to let you know by adding lemon, this could potentially alter the chemistry of the tea. Adding the lemon inhibits the binding of something like a phytochemical, or again, those polyphenols, to things like iron and calcium. So even though tea itself has a lot of beneficial health implications, the polyphenols do bind calcium, which increases your likelihood of something like osteoporosis. So with that in mind, if you add a little lemon, You might not get the same health benefits of the polyphenols, but you're also not going to have the negative implications of those polyphenols binding to the calcium. Therefore, if we're going to want your tea, you might say, which is more important? Decreasing likelihood of osteoporosis or decreasing the likelihood of something like cardiovascular disease. If you're more concerned about osteoporosis, add some extra lemon to your tea. If you're more concerned about cardiovascular disease, maybe keep that lemon out. When we sweeten our tea, at home, we're likely not using high fructose corn syrup. However, many of the sweet teas on the market that you might buy from the grocery store or that you might even have in a restaurant are going to be sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is a very common type of what we call an added sugar. It is a carbohydrate, and the high fructose corn syrup is actually a mixture of fructose and glucose. So it's not just fructose, it's going to be a mixture of the two. And it's made by wet milling the corn. What we do is we take cornstarch and we're going to take it through a process, and the outcome of that process is going to be a sweet syrup that we refer to as high fructose corn syrup. You may be curious, how is high fructose corn syrup made? Well, I encourage you to watch this video here and take note as to how we go from a cornstarch all the way to a sweet high fructose corn syrup. Also note the difference between 42, 90, and 55 high fructose corn syrup. If we're going to take and convert the cornstarches to high fructose corn syrup, you can see in this flowchart on the right-hand side the many steps that take place. For example, we're going to steep and soften. And you're like, what is steep and softening? Well, steep and softening is a very scientific term for just saying, hey, we're soaking a liquid in a below boiling temperature. So we're going to be softening the components that are in that liquid itself. We also are going to use chemical hydrolysis or hydrolysis. We're going to be using water to break bonds along with other things, chemical processes that are happening. So with this chemical hydrolysis, what we're doing is we're using what we call a decomposition reaction. So we have something that's larger and we break it down or we lyse it to something that's smaller, which is going to be, in theory, decomposing that item, and water is going to be used in that process. We're also going to be using enzymes to make that high fructose corn syrup. More specifically, we're using the enzyme glucoamylase. And glucoamylase is going to digest the starch and release the glucose. And once we have some of that glucose, what we want to do is convert some of the glucose to fructose, because fructose has a different flavor profile on the tongue. So we use glucose isomerase to take the glucose, kind of flip it or make an isomer of it to create fructose. And we're changing that glucose to fructose. So we're eventually, through this process, taking cornstarch and we're making this syrup that contains both glucose and fructose in it. But a lot of times people don't necessarily want to have high fructose corn syrup and all the calories that go with it, but they may not mind something that might be a little bit more artificial. So how do we compare saccharin and aspartame or sucralose? Well, saccharin contains a variety of different chemical elements like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and it even has some sulfur atoms to it. Sometimes people can taste that difference in that saccharin itself. But this configuration doesn't account for any calories, as the body actually doesn't know how to process saccharin. So therefore, it's going to be a calorie-free sweetener. Then we have aspartame, which contains the chemical elements carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, again, nitrogen a little bit different, and oxygen. And aspartame, we're actually using very little aspartame because of the fact that it is 180 times as sweet as table sugar. But you may say, well, wait a second, when I open that packet of Equal and I put it in my drink, it seems like there's a decent amount in there. Well, there may actually be some fillers in there, so you feel like you're putting a lot more in than you really are. We also have sucralose, and sucralose is considered the most natural as its configuration is going to be akin to natural sugar. However, it is distinctive or different from saccharin, aspartame, or traditional table sugar because there are actually some chlorine atoms associated with it. When we're looking at the nutrient components of sweet tea, let's investigate this 1 cup serving of sweet tea. So sweet tea has a few major nutrients and other listed components. For example, we have things like carbohydrate. You might say, that's a good thing. Our body needs carbohydrate. We do not need carbohydrate from added sugar though, but it does add quite a bit of flavor. We also have a little bit of protein, like the tiniest little bit, and the tiniest little bit or no fat in it. We have few vitamins and minerals, but you might wonder, well, if all we have is like sugar in the form of the sweetness for that sweet tea, and then we are consuming it, why would people want to have it? Well, first of all, it tastes good. Second of all, it accents the flavor of many different foods. And also people might want a little pick-me-up, a little caffeine, something that they're like, you know what, maybe I'll have sweet tea instead of a soda to get my caffeine for the day. And caffeine occurs naturally in the tea plant itself. And some of the beverages will actually tell you how much caffeine is in the product itself. But let's compare sweeteners that we might use in sweet tea. Even though we may on our own use a different amount of honey, table sugar, or stevia, which is an artificial sweetener, what we're going to be doing is comparing a standard serving size here. So 2 teaspoons, 2 teaspoons, 2 teaspoons. Even though with the stevia, you'll probably only put a little bit of stevia in there, but I wanted to kind of show you, again, teaspoon for teaspoon for teaspoon, or tablespoon for tablespoon for tablespoon, what is in that particular food stuff. So with honey, 2 tablespoons are going to have 136.4 calories. We have most of that coming from carbohydrates. With our table sugar, 2 tablespoons have 104 calories, with most of that coming from carbohydrates. With our stevia, which is an artificial sweetener, we have about 71 calories, again, with almost all those coming from carbohydrates. So the biggest take-home message here is if we're able to digest even an artificial sweetener like stevia, or again, something more natural like honey, or even something like table sugar, the sweetness in those digestible ingredients in our sweet tea are coming from carbohydrate itself. But what does our body do to digest some of these sweeteners? So let's look at table sugar. So with table sugar, in our mouth, salivary amylase is released. And you might say, yes, that's going to help digest the table sugar. Actually, no, that's not going to help digest the table sugar. Salivary amylase only breaks down amylose or starch. So no chemical breakdown of sucrose or table sugar is happening in the mouth itself. However, when that sucrose or that table sugar, same thing, gets to the small intestine, even though pancreatic amylase is jumping in, that's not going to digest sucrose either. You're like, wait a second. Okay, so salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase, no impact on table sugar. But in our small intestine, we have these things called microvilli, or finger-like projections. Those microvilli have a lot of cells that make them up. Those cells actually produce the enzyme sucrase, which is a disaccharide ACE. So sucrase breaks down sucrose, which is a disaccharide. So sucrase, by definition, is a disaccharide ACE. It's going to break the bond between the fructose and glucose, and it's going to allow the body to absorb that fructose and glucose, which are the monomer building blocks of that table sugar, and our enterocytes, which are going to be cells that allow things to enter, no joke. We're not very creative in the sciences. So the enterocytes allow those monomers, fructose and glucose, to be absorbed into the bloodstream for use or repackaging. So what's going on with the absorption of these digested sweeteners? Well, like we mentioned, table sugar can be digested, but a little bit more complex information may be needed for you to understand it. We actually have transporters that are used to absorb the breakdown products of the sugar from the intestine into the body itself. What about high fructose corn syrup? Well, high fructose corn syrup, like we mentioned, is made of fructose and glucose. With respect to absorbing fructose, the absorption of fructose is actually facilitated by the presence of glucose or other monosaccharides. So fructose absorption actually increases in efficiency with glucose present. If we have unabsorbed fructose, not such a good thing. This is fermented in the large intestine or the colon, which causes gas, acidic stool, discomfort. And then what we have is the unabsorbed fructose, and all that acid and gas and everything like that is going to leave your body, either through the feces or, again, the gas on its own, which is not fun either. We also have artificial sweeteners, and select sweeteners can even have a negative impact on the microbiota, or those microbes that live in a symbiotic relationship with us in our intestine. So you might say, well, artificial sweeteners, they don't have any calories, they're not really going to have many negative side effects. Well, in reality, they can impact that, again, mind-gut connection, or that gut-body connection, which we're still learning more about from the scientific research. What about the absorption of other tea components? Well, we have a tea plant, and so here's a scientific name for the tea plant itself. And the leaves actually contain floridzin, and that floridzin is going to be an example of, like we said before, a polyphenol. Like we mentioned, the polyphenols can have some positive health implications, such as decreasing glucose absorption. The results might be it normalizes blood glucose, and it can actually reduce hyperglycemia. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these positive health implications of tea in general. So like we mentioned, tea is going to provide polyphenols. And as a reminder, these are plant chemicals that act in a positive way in our body. In fact, if you want to learn a little bit more, they act also as an antioxidant. Antioxidants decrease free radical damage in our cells, they decrease inflammation in our body, and so there are some benefits associated with that. So we've got some positive health implications. However, even though traditional tea may have some fabulous health implications, Southern sweet tea has a lot of sugar. It really does. So this Southern tradition of adding a lot of sugar in the brewing may not be the best. One typical serving of sweet tea can have anywhere between 60 and 230 calories or kilocalories. So definitely something that has a lot of sugar in it. And high consumption of Southern sweet tea and other sugary beverages are associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, higher blood cholesterol, higher blood sugar, cavities or dental caries in the mouth, as well as obesity. And if we're going to talk about the fact that consuming a lot of sugary items can increase the likelihood of type 2 diabetes, we want you to understand that this is a real concern. Sweet tea, like I said, if it's going to be a traditional Southern sweet tea, it contains a lot of table sugar. And that table sugar is added as this, again, simple syrup. And we can add a lot of simple syrup and a lot of sugar into that drink itself, which can cause some pretty significant complications with type 2 diabetes. I just want to let you know that an increase in sugar intake increases the inability to metabolize the sugar in the bloodstream by using insulin. So we can actually have, the more sugar you take in, the more your body kind of doesn't know what to do with that sugar, is a simplistic way of saying it. And at some point, if you're genetically predisposed to type 2 diabetes, if you have a sedentary lifestyle and you're consuming excessive amounts of sugar, you do put yourself at a higher risk for what we call insulin resistance. So when you're consuming that sweet tea, even though your body's producing insulin, which is the hormone that tells your body, hey, decrease blood sugar, let's store that or use it or do something with it, the cells in your body might say, you always are drinking sweet stuff. You are always having insulin. So it actually becomes resistant to responding properly to the overconsumption of those sugars. And so blood sugar can remain high, which brings about complications. So since the sugar can get excreted in a situation where we're over-consuming sugar, we might have type 2 diabetes, that sugar spilling into our urine itself, so you're literally peeing out these calories you're consuming. Some people with type 2 diabetes may actually experience some pretty strong fatigue as well as temporary weight loss if that type 2 diabetes is completely uncontrolled. Another complex situation is that consuming a lot of sweeteners, such as traditional Southern sweet tea, is going to lead to a potential increase in blood cholesterol. Kind of interesting. You may not think about that, but sugary drinks such as sweet tea, even though they don't contain any cholesterol, our liver is going to respond to all that sugar by producing more cholesterol. So, not necessarily a good thing. Another complexity is not only is it producing more cholesterol, it's producing more of what we call the LDL, or that loser or bad cholesterol. And so we're not seeing an increase in the good cholesterol, we're actually seeing an increase in the bad cholesterol, which can bring up your likelihood of struggling with things like cardiovascular disease. So you may not think sweet tea increases cardiovascular disease, but it can. So you might say, well, you know what, I'm just gonna go to artificial sweeteners. If the sweet tea is going to make me sick, we're just going to have artificial sweeteners instead. Well, unlike sucrose that's used in Southern sweet tea, we don't really have that, increase in calories, increase in sugar if we're using those artificial sweeteners or the sugar alcohols or even some of the novel sweeteners. So the artificial sweeteners are going to range from tasting 200 to 700 times sweeter than table sugar sometimes. So you need a lot less of some of those artificial sweeteners. One bad thing is, or one interesting thing, not necessarily bad, is they're commonly crafted from chemicals, which we're still learning more about. But one of the things that we are learning is that some of these artificial sweeteners can lead to gastrointestinal problems such as gas, bloating, or even diarrhea. And some of the novel sweeteners that are coming from plant sources may not have a problem with the blood spikes, but again, we're still learning more about them in general. Some examples of some of the novel sweeteners include allulose, monk fruit, stevia, and tagatose. So what are some other health implications of sweet tea made with high fructose corn syrup? Well, the high fructose corn syrup consists of, like I said, that fructose and glucose, but they're not chemically bound together. So sweet tea is made of sucrose, which has the fructose and glucose bound together. High fructose corn syrup has those two monosaccharides, but they are separated from each other. They're not bound. So what we have is an enzyme in our liver, phosphofructokinase, which is going to help us determine, well, do we need fuel? And so the liver is going to help in that determination. And so if we have glucose from that high fructose corn syrup going into the blood and going to the liver might discern what's going on, and it might not be real happy, again, like I said, with a high increase in both glucose as well as fructose if we're having a sweet tea with that high fructose corn syrup itself. When the fructose moves into the liver, something I do want to let you know is the liver can have an increase in what we call fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease can actually cause liver failure, and there is increased research that's going on with what we call non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome. So non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome is a thing, and if you overconsume really unhealthy foods and have a really sedentary lifestyle, you can increase your likelihood of struggling from this and potentially even having life complexities or death associated with it. So you might say, okay, I'm not going to have table sugar, not going to have it with the simple syrup, I'm not going to have my tea with the high fructose corn syrup, I'm just going to have the artificial sweeteners then. Okay, we keep going back and forth. Artificial sweeteners now. Well, artificial sweeteners are often used to reduce the number of calories in a product, yes, and so you're not going to have those huge sugar spikes. You can see this as a benefit, especially if you're looking for alternative to products that do contain sugar. However, we're still researching this. The long-term health implications of artificial sweeteners are not entirely understood. So we have additional confusion that stems from the fact that manufacturers are not even required to list the concentrations of the sweeteners that they use. So if you're going to go and pick up a diet tea that's sweet and has an artificial sweetener in it, you may know what sweetener is in it, but you may not know how much of that sweetener there is in it. So if you keep consuming foods and drinks that have these artificial sweeteners in it, you might be summatively consuming quite a bit of these artificial sweeteners. So what does the research really say? Well, there have been some studies that claim that some of the sweeteners are actually carcinogens. They can potentially cause cancer. However, more research is really needed because the studies were reviewed by the FDA, and the FDA claimed that, there's some scientific shortcomings. We can't say for sure one way or the other. Other studies have looked at the possible implications on gut microbes, or again, those microbiota, and how they might interfere with receptors, perception, other things from the gut itself, and like I said, that mind-gut connection or that body-gut connection. So the short version is, while the impact is not certain, it seems that artificial sweeteners should be investigated or consumed with a little bit of caution. I myself do consume drinks with some artificial sweeteners, but I do so in moderation. When we talk about hospitalization, you might think honey's pretty safe. Who's going to the hospital because of honey? I do want to let you know that there are some spores that are found in honey, especially in honey that you might have like raw honey that's not pasteurized, it hasn't been treated. This can actually cause problems in little ones. So if you're someone who's like, I'm going to make some all-natural baby food, and you're using honey as a sweetener and it's going to be a raw honey, we can actually have bacteria that can cause botulism. That botulism itself is more likely to occur in children up to 12 months old because their stomach is not nearly as acidic, so it can't kill the bacteria that are associated with that infant botulism. And you might think, oh, it's just a little foodborne illness, they'll get over it. Well, in reality, severe cases of this botulism infection can lead to paralysis and potentially even death. Table sugar itself, surprisingly, isn't as deadly as honey, at least acutely to the little ones. It can cause inflammation, and inflammatory diseases are on the rise. It's not very good for you. It also can cause problems with the liver producing fatty acids, which can again lead to that fatty liver disease. Consumption of sugary drinks causes 184,000 deaths annually. You might say, oh my gosh, that seems really weird. But if you think about it, like I said, if we've got type 2 diabetes and we have this large increase in the consumption of these sugary beverages, complications associated with overconsumption of those sweet drinks can be deadly in some instances if people have advanced diseases. So something to consider if you're someone who has been diagnosed with something like, again, advanced type 2 diabetes and it's kind of out of control. And we don't want to go to the hospital. We want to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. And with that in mind, we want to talk about food safety. And so when we're talking about tea storage, you can look down on this table and see unprepared tea, like for example, packaged tea. How long does that last? Loose tea, how long does that last? Powdered tea, how long does that last? Well, it's similar where packaged, loose, and powdered tea all can last in the pantry for up to a year. If you've made the tea and you're like, oh my gosh, then we have this prepared tea, refrigerated, that is only gonna last 3 to 5 days. So the more water you have in it, the prepared tea, the shorter the shelf life. However, if you want to have, again, your packaged tea or even your prepared tea last longer, you can put it in the freezer. So with tea storage, things to keep in mind, sugar and temperature are the main components that affect shelf life. We can store tea in the refrigerator, again, a refrigerator that's 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower to increase its shelf life. And if the tea is prepared tea and it becomes cloudy or has sediment at the bottom, it's gone bad. Get rid of it. If we're adding lemon, select fruit juices, or other sweeteners, depending upon how much you're adding, this can actually shorten the shelf life as well. Another item that's going to have an impact with regard to the shelf life of the tea product is the moisture content. The two main stages of black tea processing are going to decrease the moisture content. So we have these fresh black tea leaves, well, we have withering, which decreases the moisture content from about 75% to about 60% or so. Then we want to do is we want to dry those tea leaves. So people who are manufacturing the black tea leaves are then going to dry it. From 60%, it goes all the way down to about 5%. So very, very, very low moisture content. With different types of sweeteners, they vary in moisture content significantly. So crystalline sucrose or table sugar has a 0.04% moisture, so very, very low moisture content. And it has a water activity of 0.227. So again, very low water activity. So it has a really long shelf life, so you can keep that table sugar in your cupboard for a while. If we're going to take this crystalline sucrose and we're going to make, again, that simple syrup or that liquid sugar, it's obviously going to have a much higher moisture content and a higher water activity. Honey, even though it is a liquid, it has 15 to 20% moisture content. It has a water activity that's still pretty low at 0.552. High fructose corn syrup has about 28% moisture content, and it still doesn't have a ridiculous water activity. It's at 0.738. Some liquid sweeteners contain 42 to 86 grams of sugar for every 100 grams of water. And like we mentioned, due to their high water content, they could potentially spoil a lot faster. The general rule of thumb is, again, a few days in the refrigerator, and that's all we really want to keep it there for food safety. So honey is something that's very interesting with regard to microbial activity. At least I think so. Honey naturally inhibits microbial growth. Kind of interesting. So you're like, wow. With honey, it has a pH ranging from 3.4 to 6.1. So it's not really, really acidic, nor is it really basic. It's kind of, again, a little bit acidic, but some of them are close to neutral. It has a lower water content. It has a lower water activity, but that's not necessarily going to inhibit the microbial growth. We have natural things inside unpasteurized honey that are actually going to act as, again, antimicrobial. So even though we might find some microbiota in the honeycombs themselves, they're ones that we are not overly concerned about consuming if we are a healthy adult with a functioning immune system. We also have some yeasts which we can find in honey itself. We've got a long list of them. However, again, those might change the, profile of how the honey tastes, but it's not necessarily a big concern because, again, the water activity is very low, and so we're not worried as much about that microbial growth. Pollens, interestingly, may affect the intestine of the honeybees, which affects the honey produced. So you can look here at this image and see honey is not honey is not honey. Honey looks very different depending upon the pollen that's used, the bees themselves, the climate. So many different factors are going to affect the honey that is produced. But back to honey and its antibiotic benefits. Honey is effective against pathogens such as E. coli, certain types of salmonella, etc. In fact, individuals in a lot of older generations, again, years ago, might take and put honey on an open wound to help increase the healing of the wound and decrease any bacteria that might want to grow in that wound. We also have microbial activity associated with high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup, or like we've used the acronym HFCS, is something that has a lot of sugar in it. If we consume it, it's going to lead to bloating and gas. We actually have microbes in our intestine which kind of like to ferment it a little bit, and it's a source of energy for that bacteria. When the bacteria are going to ferment it or use it for their own energy, gas is a byproduct. High fructose corn syrup also causes plaque buildup on the teeth. We have microorganisms or bacteria that live in our mouth. The sugar from that high fructose corn syrup is a fast energy source for some of these bacteria, and they can produce a sticky protein that is like this plaque on your teeth itself. And as we discuss sweeteners, there's some new products on the market. For example, Pure Cane. Pure Cane is a zero-calorie sweetener made with a fermented sugar cane. It's created by a food production team under Amyris. They were tasked with making a sugar-tasting product, but without the bitter artificial sweetener taste. And so the scientists developed this sustainable, zero-calorie sweetener from the remains of sugar cane itself. Well, some critics and some consumers, they can't taste the difference between the regular sugar and the new product. So it's gaining some popularity. So with companies all over making these zero-calorie sweeteners, Pure Cane might be something that you might see a little more of. When we talk about the future of sweet tea, let's talk about some current tea trends in general. Tea brands are focusing more on sustainability as well as some artisanal teas. Also, if you go to the grocery store, you might notice that there are some ready-to-drink or ice bottled teas that are on the market that are new. Additionally, there are some teas that focus on health and benefits to wellness. You may also see teas that are infused with nutrient-dense foods like beets, sweet potatoes, and even broccoli. Somehow I don't think that tea is one that I'm going to enjoy, but to each their own. There are some problems in the future for tea though. Climate change has caused growing concern for tea's future. There's a decreased quality and lowering yields for tea because of this climate change. We've got higher levels of carbon dioxide or CO2 that are resulting because of this. This actually changes the nutrients and the caffeine levels in the tea itself. So we have people who are crop science, computer science individuals who are looking at soil health as well as tracking climate change. And they themselves are trying to figure out, do we need to move some of these growing locations? So some of the farms are actually moving to more climate appropriate locations such as California. And if you're wanting some of the health benefits of tea, but you don't necessarily want to have a big old glass of tea, you can consume a tea extract. You can see the flow chart on the right-hand side here, as well as you can see that something like a black tea extract can even be bought online from several different producers. If you want to learn more about it, you can click on this link. And if you're looking at the flow chart and you're trying to understand some of what's going on, some terms that might help you. Precipitate is a solid. Supernatant is going to be a liquid. So with this finished black tea extract, you may notice that sometimes it is going to be there as a liquid. You can also dry that liquid down too, but it's not going to be something like a tea solid that we kind of keep. Now that you've learned about some pros and cons of tea in general, as well as sweet tea, and you've learned about lots of different sweeteners that can be used, I know sometimes there's a lot of confusion. So what I encourage you to do is to stop in the Virtual Tutoring Center, stop in my office hours, do some research on your own with reputable sources. Let us know how we can help.